Hello, everyone. My name is Michał Dziąg, and I'm the Research Director at the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on the results of Business First 2022, the latest study in the research series designed to examine how businesses across Canada perceive and experience the services provided by various levels of government. This iteration is of particular importance due to the fact that it was the first survey of businesses that we've done since the start of the pandemic. And as such, it was very much designed to look at the impact of COVID-19 on businesses across the country. While we've tracked several key metrics from the previous iterations and looked at such elements as service reputation, experience, expectations, priorities for improvement, and channel usage, the results obviously have to be read against the background of the impact that the pandemic has had on the environment in which businesses operate. And this is very much what the focus of Business First 2022 has been, as you will see in just a moment. I'm also happy to let you know that the full report based on the study results is now available for purchase on our website. You can access it by going to citizenfirst.ca. Now, before I hand it over to our presenter, Marina Gilson from Ipsos, I just wanted to let you know that the webinar will consist of a presentation, which should take 40 minutes or so, followed by a Q&A segment during which you will be able to submit your questions by typing them into the chat box on your screen. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for later viewing following today's session. And so now I will hand it over to Marina Gilson, Director of Ipsos Public Affairs, with whom we've been working closely on this project over the past several months, to speak to the key findings of Business First 2022. Over to you, Marina.
Thank you, Michał. It's really a great pleasure to be here today, and I'm glad to see so much interest in the report findings. In this iteration, as Michał mentioned, we're looking at a number of important tracking measures, things that go back over a decade, as well as looking at what the impact of the COVID-19 situation has been and how governments are faring in terms of the attitudes of the business community in Canada. We'll speak briefly about the background and approach today, and then we'll move on, talk about the impact of COVID-19, see where small business owners in Canada are in terms of some international comparisons, look at how government service reputations have fared, what businesses have actually experienced in obtaining services from their governments. We'll look at channel usage, priorities for service improvement, and finally we'll have a Q&A. Looking at the background and approach, Business First is a series of studies that has been conducted every 2 to 3 years under the direction of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. They cover various dimensions of the evolving service environment, track perceptions of service quality and performance for a wide range of services offered by municipal, regional, provincial, territorial, and federal governments. As mentioned, the objective was to determine the impact of COVID-19 on businesses' attitudes and experience with accessing government services, and to update our understanding of the service reputation of governments in Canada, satisfaction with government services, the drivers of satisfaction, and usage and preference of delivery channels. The study has evolved pretty significantly since 2004, and as mentioned, the key change for this particular wave is to measure the impact of the COVID-19 situation, which really was an unprecedented challenge for governments over the past year. We conducted telephone interviews with nearly 2,000 business respondents across Canada. We were in field from December to March, and at the end we adjusted the data to the universe of businesses by jurisdiction and size of business. We really appreciate the jurisdictions that subscribed to this round of the research, and they did so at a time when we were still facing a lot of COVID-related issues and challenges. The province of British Columbia, Government of Canada, province of Manitoba, the Northwest Territories, and Yukon all stepped up to help us move this project forward. Looking at the impact of COVID-19. What we found is that the business community was not particularly positive about how governments performed in managing the COVID-19 situation. All of the scores are less than 50. Now, these are the 0 to 100 scores, which basically look at each of the points on the 5-point scale. So the lowest possible score is 0, which would mean that everybody rated the service as very poor. The highest possible score of 100 would only be attained if everyone rated the service at 5 or very good. So we see that with all of the scores ranging below 50 or very nearly below 50, that the governments actually did not perform well in the eyes of the business community. And as a result, we recommend that governments need to assure businesses that more will be done to prepare for future crises. We asked people to the extent to which they agreed with a number of statements. Among these, the ones that really come out the highest in terms of level of agreement, again on the 0 to 100 scale, are that government should increase digital access to services to cope with surges of demand during times of crises, that much more should be done to ensure that governments are prepared and ready to act in the event of future crises, and that government should provide more flexible services to businesses even when there isn't a crisis. And of course, as a result of what we have observed in reactions to government response, as well as the high level of agreement with those statements, we definitely concur that governments in Canada should increase digital access to services, do much more to be prepared and ready to act in the event of an emergency. And I should add, should also make sure that there's effective communication in place so that small business owners and managers, large business owners and managers in Canada are aware that this is being done. And government should provide more flexible service to businesses even when there isn't a crisis. In terms of using COVID-19 support services, just over 1/2 of businesses in Canada did access some form of COVID-19 support service. In most cases, those who use these services use the Government of Canada, 41% provincial or territorial government, and much lower proportions used municipal or regional governments. And a few remembered using services but weren't sure which level of government was involved. Overall, people are moderately satisfied with the services that they got. This score is pretty comparable to the satisfaction for services, all government services overall. And so while we would say, 2/3 rated as 4 or 5, they're positive, but we certainly can't say that they're wildly enthusiastic about the services that they received from governments that were related to COVID-19 support. And I think this is very important to understand because significant amounts of money were spent to support businesses. However, the way that these services were delivered appears to have left a lot to be desired. Just to provide some international context, I'm going to provide some index scores that will show where Canadian businesses have been at over the past while. We can see that small business owners prior to the pandemic were consistently much higher in their ratings of their basically consumer confidence. We're looking at the Ipsos disruption barrier here, barometer here. But as we evolved through the pandemic, small business owners and consumers alike both declined in terms of their level of confidence. And importantly, small business owners no longer were more positive than the general population. And that carries on pretty consistently right through to Q1 of 2022, and starts to increase and again break away from the sentiment level of the general population starting in Q2. So we'll be very interested to watch how those numbers progress over time. Comparing in an international context, and there's all sorts of pitfalls in making that sort of comparison, but it remains seen that Canada ranks amongst the lowest of all of the countries in which we have this measure in place over time, and to a very significant degree, compared to, let's say, the United States is much higher up on the list. Canada is, the fourth or fifth lowest across all of the countries, which is a very important thing to understand within this context of serving business clients. These business clients that we are serving are much less positive towards their finances and outlook and the stability of the economy and so on than is the case across most international benchmarks. In terms of their financial health index, small business owners are only about as likely to be thriving and existing versus those who are struggling or sinking. So about half of small business owners in Canada would say that they're struggling or sinking. And you can see the trend over time going back over the past year and a half, that it has remained really below the average or zero net score. In terms of service reputation, this is important because this is how people in business perceive various levels of government in Canada. And you can see that general perceptions of the service that governments are providing has been rising steadily since 2010 through to 2016, leveled off and is even declining in the previous two measures in 2019 and 2022. So it is really important that governments improve perceptions among businesses in Canada through more effective communications and improved service delivery. In terms of service experience, in the previous measure, we were looking at service reputation, which is a more general score. How well do you think governments are doing? Now we're looking at a much more specific score, specific to a recent service experience with various levels of government in Canada. And in terms of overall satisfaction, we're able to track this back on the national level back to 2007. And again, the trend here is pretty clear. There were some increases up to and including 2016. And since then, we've seen stabilization and then decline. So we're seeing that businesses are less satisfied with government service provision now than they were in 2016. We look at the CSI, and the Client Satisfaction Index is a composite score that's based on three key elements of satisfaction with services. For the governments in Canada, the I was satisfied score has declined from 70 to 67. Best service anywhere has declined from 57 to 55, while exceeded my expectations has remained constant at 54. So the overall client satisfaction index, it stands at 58 as compared to 60 in 2019. This isn't a statistically significant difference. We have to look at that and say, okay, it's on par, but clearly not in the improvement that we would have hoped for when we were looking at the 2019 results. Also look at the absolute value there of 58. And again, this is on the 0 to 100 point score. So there's a lot of distance between a score of 58 and the optimal score of 100. So really we have to conclude that businesses are only moderately satisfied with government services, and the governments in Canada should make a greater effort to provide a more positive service experience for their business clients. We'll just step back from that and break it down a little bit and really look at where the client satisfaction index comes from in terms of the research data. So we have the three major statements, which are each ranked on a 5-point scale. I should say rated on a 5-point scale, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree, for a composite overall score, as mentioned, of 58 for the overall client satisfaction index. You can see that it's much easier for people to be satisfied, which is the highest score there, despite a decline from 2019, than it is for people to strongly agree that the service equals the best anywhere and that it exceeded their expectations. We're not going to go in detail here, and we certainly can provide a lot of detail in the national report, which Michal mentioned is available now. But I just want to point out that we look at a large number of attributes for each service experience and have respondents rate each of these attributes. And while the numbers for the overall satisfaction index are on par, we also note that the majority of individual attributes, the 0 to 100 score has declined, and in most cases it's done so significantly. When we look at staff service attributes, we see relatively high ratings across the board, ranging from 69 for extra mile to 77 for competence, with knowledge and felt good also being relatively highly rated. We also look at channel-specific attributes, such as how long people had to wait in offices and so on. In particular, of importance to note is the decline from 2019 to 2022 in terms of information attained on the website, and also from 70 to 64, significant decline for agreement that the navigation, website navigation was easy or good. So we are definitely seeing some important declines in satisfaction when it comes to websites. This is particularly important to understand because of because websites continue to be an important source of information for businesses, an important means of conducting transactions with governments. And we will see, as we look at the matrix of importance versus performance to identify the primary drivers, that decline in these scores is really very bad news. For the first time, we also looked at the ethnicity of owners and senior managers of the businesses that were included in the survey. And we find that for the majority of businesses, there's no visible minorities. 16% of the businesses in the survey included visible minorities other than Indigenous. 7% Indigenous, and we weren't able to classify 15% of businesses. When we look at the client satisfaction index amongst these three groups, we can see that that businesses with visible minorities included in their owners and senior managers actually have the highest of the three groups, the highest client satisfaction index, followed by those with no visible minorities, while those with Indigenous owners or managers have the lowest. These differences aren't statistically significant, and we will look forward with interest to how these measures track over time in future iterations of Business First. In terms of whether the business is majority Aboriginal or Indigenous owned, a fairly small proportion of the population of businesses in Canada, 4%, do in fact meet the majority Aboriginal owned benchmark, and they do have a slightly lower but not significantly lower client satisfaction index with recent service experiences as compared to those who are not majority Aboriginal owned. Okay, now Michal, I'll turn it back to you if you'd like to speak about channel usage.
Thank you, Marina. When we look at channel usage, the first and main takeaway is that the use of digital channels, including both websites and email, has been steadily increasing since 2010. It has essentially tripled, going from 23% of transactions all the way up to 67% in this iteration. The websites by themselves have now reached around 50%, up from 14% in 2010, and the use of email has increased from 9 to 15% in the same time frame. So this is a significant growth, and this trend is likely to continue with online channels making further inroads. So let's go to the next slide. And now let's look at the broader range of channels, especially through the lens of whether they were used as the first, the main, or as other channel to access services. And so websites are used by about half of all businesses as both the first and the main channel. For the telephone, it's a quarter of businesses in both cases. And then email is more likely to be used as another channel, but it's not typically the first one or the main one. I would just note that the telephone, which used to be the most used channel not so long ago, has experienced a steady yet substantial decrease in usage. Back in 2010, it was used for 44% of interactions, whereas now this proportion has been reduced nearly by half. As for the other traditional channels, such as in-person visits to an office or mail, they're now used by a fairly small proportion of businesses. In both cases, it's around 3%. Especially for mail, the drop since 2010 has been quite significant, as the percentage went down from 17%. And I would also note that most businesses have used more than one channel, with the average being 1.8 channels per service interaction, which is consistent with the previous iteration of this research. Let's go to the next slide. And when it comes to CSI scores for individual channels, the highest ratings are provided for office or in-person visits at 67, followed by websites, email, and the telephone. The telephone receives the lowest score, and it has traditionally been the problem channel, so to speak, typically being rated the lowest. However, email is the only channel in this iteration for which we've observed a significant decline in the ratings. For the other channels, the scores are more or less at the same level as previously. Now, given their importance, it should be a priority to improve the quality of services via the two digital channels, since the results suggest that there is definitely room for improvement as far as business client experience is concerned. And now let's go to the last slide in this section. And on this slide, you can see that we also track CSI based on the number of channels used. And the ratings appear to decline only very slightly when businesses use 2 or more channels to get the service. The CSI scores basically stay in the same range. And this seems to suggest that business clients are, in general, okay with accessing services in more than one way. And as I mentioned earlier, most businesses have, in fact, done this. So just to sum up, the main message is that the online channels are increasing their dominance. And this is something that should be supported by providing better service through those channels. But at the same time, it should be noted that businesses also use other ways to access government services, and seamless transition between different modes of service delivery also continues to be important. And at this point, I'll hand it back to Marina.
Thank you, Michal. And we'll just move forward now and look at priorities for service improvement. I'll just speak briefly to this to give you a bit of a background about what we're going to be looking at. When we look at key driver analysis, or looking at what the priority drivers are, we really look at two things: the impact from high to low in terms of how important the services are, how much impact the attributes have on the overall client satisfaction index, versus performance, so from low to high. So some things in the protect quadrant, for instance, these attributes would be those that are high in impact but are already being well served. They also are highly rated in terms of how businesses view the performance. In the improve quadrant, we really focus on the attributes that fall in this quadrant, because those are the ones that are high in terms of their impact on overall satisfaction, but lower in terms of their performance, in terms of how they're viewed by the customers. We tend to place less priority in looking at the lower half of the quadrant, but we do see that there are some that should be monitored, some attributes. It doesn't have much impact, but performance isn't great. And we want to maintain those in the lower right quadrant because the driver or component isn't as important, and it's well served at the present time. So here we're looking at the importance performance matrix for all government services across Canada per a recent and specific service transaction. What falls out into the improve quadrant are future issues, having issues or problems when trying to access a service. Timeliness, which is no surprise given the impacts on service that were part of managing the COVID-19 situation. Going the extra mile, and of course ease of access, which is of course related to many of the other attributes. Attributes that need to be protected are primarily those around face-to-face staff interactions. These are very positive. Felt good, competence, knowledge, communication, and of course outcome. Other than outcome, most of these pertain to the face-to-face transactions or person-to-person transactions, including telephone. They're highly rated, and they are important in terms of their impact to the client satisfaction index. What's important to note, though, is all of those attributes that are related to personal interactions need to somehow be translated for other channels, particularly the online channels. So we're making people happy when they talk to our government people, but that's not necessarily translating into a positive emotional response when it comes to online transactions. Just focusing on those priorities for service improvement. We've got extra mile, future issues, ease of access, and timeliness. Let's look also at the drivers for digital channels. This falls out a little bit differently. Future issues and timeliness are still important. Issue resolution also in the improved quadrant, and performance way over at the bottom of all of the attributes. In addition, website navigation falls into the improved quadrant. In terms of the attributes, where we're doing well, what we need to keep doing well, ease of access, outcome, which of course is people got the service they wanted, communication, people knew how to find that service, what they needed to do, and information web, which is still a priority and is more highly rated than website navigation. And we have a wealth of information that was collected from people, business people, when they were talking about what they would like to see in terms of service improvements, what experiences they had, what it was that they think should be improved. But for today's presentation, obviously we can't present everything in the national report, but we did look at some of the ways to improve the online service experience, and a lot of them relate to the attributes that were identified as priority attributes, things that have the most potential to impact overall satisfaction with services. People suggest things like, I think having a live chat feature would be beneficial. And what's behind that kind of thinking is that if they're having problems with the website, or that the information that they're looking for isn't quite exactly specified in the areas that they're reading on the website, they could then talk to a live person and get the verification or information or instructions on how to use the website that they need. People talk about navigation a lot. They don't use the word navigation. They say things like, when I initially logged on, I found it difficult to find out what I needed to do and how to access things. The last time I was on there, it was a wild goose chase. And that's not how we want our website users to walk away thinking. Sometimes on government websites, it's hard to find what I'm looking for. The structure of the menus, I'll click and it will take me where I didn't want to go. People suggest better search engines, that the government ones never seem to work well. I don't have any complaints. The website worked well. I got what I needed. So we're doing it right some of the time. And finally, make sure the information is correct before they make changes to the website information. And that was a bit of a theme that we see throughout business customers' comments about attaining government services during the COVID area. Things were changing pretty rapidly, and the websites didn't always keep pace, which caused some frustration for some of our business users. So in terms of improving service overall, coming from all of this information and more, really, we look at the following as being the priorities. In transactions which involve staff interactions, it is important that staff are trained and enabled to go the extra mile to make sure that customers get what they need. And in this age of multi-channel usage, we do see that in a lot of cases, people are trying to get problems resolved or issues dealt with. By the time they're speaking with a live person, they've already gone through a number of steps, possibly online, and possibly waited quite some time to get on the telephone with the live person that they need to talk to about it. We recommend reviewing the customer journey and identifying pain points in order to reduce the number of clients who experience issues. We suggest that multiple efficient means of contact be provided to clients who do experience problems or who need help with the website. And finally, we recommend user experience research that focuses on the ease with which business clients can find the information or the place to start the service transaction. This should be undertaken to make it quick and easy for users to find what they need. Issue resolution, also one of the priority drivers or attributes. So let's take a bit of a look at that. When we look at how many people said that they had an issue or a problem during the specific and recent service transaction that was discussed in the research, 20% said, yes, I did, which is an increase from the 14% reported in 2019. As you can see, this has a huge impact on the CSI. Amongst those who had an issue or a problem, the CSI averages at 35 on the 0 to 100 point scale. Those who didn't have a problem or an issue were nearly twice as satisfied, coming in at 64 on the 0 to 100 scale. Time spent is another of the issues that was identified as a priority driver, timeliness. When we look at what happens to satisfaction when people spend longer periods of time trying to find where to start a service or trying to get specific information, we see that the CSI declines as time increases. We start around 65, 67 CSIs if the transaction takes 10 minutes or less. And again, that's just the time to start the transaction or get the information. It declines quite steeply for website, down to 54 if it takes 11 to 20 minutes, but remains relatively stable. Again, the CSI is 54 when we're looking at over 20 minutes. Telephone, on the other hand, goes from 65 to 63 for an 11 if it takes 11 to 20 minutes, but it declines quite precipitously to 46 if people spend more than 20 minutes on the telephone trying to get information or start a transaction. If it's over 20 minutes, it's declined to really quite a low level. When we also talked to respondents about how long they think a transaction should take, and when it's how many minutes spent online looking for something or finding the place to start a transaction, they say, yeah, 8 minutes is reasonable. But when people recall an actual recent service experience, how long they spend was 13 minutes, which is significantly longer. The gap's even greater when we look at telephone interactions. People think that, yeah, 15 minutes should get her done. But in terms of the actual national experience with all levels of government in Canada, it actually took 24 minutes as far as I recalled. Of course, these are averages. We know timeliness is a priority of customer experience for governments. So anything that governments can do to reduce the time it takes to access services will pay off in terms of increasing the client satisfaction scores. We also note that online transactions are taking longer. In 2019, it was an average of 11 minutes, which has increased to the current level of 15 minutes for online transactions. Oh, okay. I was expecting another slide, which might not have been there. Telephone transactions are similarly have also been edging up in length. And as mentioned, you know, in the space of time that we have today, We can't present everything that's in the national report, but those details and many more are available now. So we'll turn it over now to questions and answers. And Michal, if you'd be so kind as to lead us off with some of the questions we might have received.
Thank you, Marina. So we're still waiting for the audience to submit questions, and I would invite all of you to, if you have a question or a comment maybe that you would like us to respond to type those into the chat box on your screen. So I'll be reading those out as they come in. But maybe as we wait for questions, I'll first of all, thank you, Marina, for a great presentation. Again, I do encourage everyone. These were just highlights of the research. I do encourage you to visit our website to obtain the full national report, which provides obviously much more detail and provides a much fuller context for the results. I do encourage you to visit that, but maybe I'll kind of kick things off just to provide kind of a broader perspective on this research. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, I know we have, quite a high number of participants today, representing, I'm sure, a variety of jurisdictions from across the country and maybe beyond. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background on this study and on what we do. This was the 7th iteration, obviously, in this research series, which we started back in 2004. And obviously, over the years, we've maintained certain approaches, we've tracked certain metrics and so on, but the focus obviously has been changing, and I think you did see it earlier on one of the slides that Marina was presenting. So I was just wondering, maybe Marina, I was just curious if you would would like to comment on maybe some of the challenges that there are currently with this type of research, speaking to businesses about their interactions with governments and so on, and maybe to see if you had any thoughts about the future of this type of research. This is definitely something that we at the ICCS are pondering all the time, and obviously we did have discussions about that. So I was just wondering if you may have a couple of thoughts on the current challenges and the future of this type of research.
Yeah, thanks, Michal. The difficulty that we have, the main difficulty is in terms of the actual research approach itself. We find that in this instance, we've used a telephone interviewing approach, and with the privacy legislation that protects people's business email addresses, there isn't any kind of readily available alternate means to conduct the research. So I think it's unlikely that privacy legislation will loosen up in the future. If anything, I would expect the opposite to be the case. We also found that during this particular point in time, we found that quite a few businesses either weren't as active, even as late as the December through March timeframe. There were a lot of people, of course, are working off-site, and we did find it more difficult to reach live respondents than we had done in the past. We also found that in some areas, the number of available businesses had also declined because people had ceased to operate, or at least ceased to answer any of their telephones. So those are all issues, and for which there's no easy answer in the foreseeable future. It's also the case, though, that at the same time, we thank all of our respondents, as always, for taking the time to complete a 10 or 15-minute telephone interview and think back and really ponder the details of a recent service transaction, as well as provide input on a wide variety of issues. In terms of other future elements, of course, one of the things that we're always interested in is really looking to see what other areas we can question businesses about, and what becomes important. We couldn't have looked into a crystal ball and seen that that this major crisis was going to be coming upon not just the governments, but the businesses and the people of Canada with the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that that was impacted as a result. But it's sure been interesting to be in a position where we can not only measure all of that stuff, but where we have just such a huge legacy data going back to 2004 that we can compare against to see the actual trends and the actual impact of such an unusual situation. At the same time as our business respondents have told us, they don't think that COVID-19 is going to be the last storm that governments are going to have to weather. So it'll be very interesting to watch to see what governments do in fact do to be more prepared for future future crises, which are probably inevitable and may not take at all the sort of form that the COVID-19 pandemic did. So that'll be interesting to watch. And I think, as I mentioned, it's super important for governments to connect with the business communities across Canada and be very vocal about what they are doing to be more prepared to assist businesses during times of future crises.
Thank you, Marina. This is great. So we do now have quite a number of questions trickling in. So, and I do apologize ahead of time. We only have 15 minutes left. If I do not get to your question, but definitely please feel free to, if we don't get to your question, please send me a separate or send us a separate email or contact us at the ICCS and we'll be happy to respond to that. So the first question was whether or not you could speak to any jurisdictional differences that were observed.
Well, obviously, we only divulge the jurisdictional findings to the subscribing jurisdictions. We do see pretty significant differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that's always one of the most interesting parts of this work. But when you're looking at, for example, the North, we've got Yukon and Northwest Territories. They're both subscribers, and they're working in an environment that's hugely different from the more urban, southern, more connected sorts of environments that others are working in. We also do see that across the board, all of the subscribers that we're talking to are really passionate about wanting to improve services to businesses. And we do see that the subscriber scores tend to be higher than the average scores for the rest of Canada. And I personally believe it's that commitment to really making a difference in service provision that makes that difference.
Absolutely. And I think the second question is a little bit related to that. Can you speak to some of the department's agencies that had the highest scores or most increased scores? And obviously, we don't, in the national report, we don't necessarily report on specific agencies or organizations and so on. We do report on scores by various levels of government or service categories and so on. So I think that's the basic answer. I'm not sure, Marina, if you had anything to add.
I agree. That's true. At the same time, we do, within the reports, provide best-in-class scores for some of the key measures. So one of the subscribers can pat themselves on the back because they got the highest overall CSI. Another subscriber is laudable. They've got the highest online penetration while still maintaining quite a high CSI. So yeah, those differences are there, and we don't share jurisdiction A's results with jurisdiction B, but we do provide comparisons both to the national averages, and we do show, okay, this is the best in class. You're looking pretty good, but You're not the best in class. So that's all built into the reporting on the subscriber level. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is, at TBS, we are looking to have departments measure client satisfaction. It is not currently being measured or reported on. What measures do you believe would be easiest to apply to the GC at large? For instance, pop-up surveys on government websites.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to discuss that in a lot more detail. This survey is a general population survey, so we go out to a random selection of people who may or may not have used any one specific transaction. We talk to them about a recent service transaction, and within, depending on which sample group they're in, it's with a subscribing jurisdiction in some cases, or not in the case of the national sample. In terms of providing a measure, I think the pop-up approach is really a good one. You can get a sample of respondents who have recently used a specific government service. Then you can compare across one service versus another, one department versus another, and so on. So that is really an exceptionally good way to do the research, as long as you're getting reasonably good response rates. And also, it's important to look at whether people who try to access the service but aren't successful, are we including those people in the sample? And if not, do we at least know what issues they encountered and how many of them had issues, because that's really one of the first steps in the customer journey, is identifying those pain points. Absolutely.
Thank you. The next question is, were Ontario and Quebec businesses included in the survey? And I can very quickly jump in just to let you know that Ontario and Quebec, the provinces did not participate in this iteration of the study. They did participate in previous ones. However, some businesses from those jurisdictions would have been included as part of the, I guess, national sample. And Marina, I'm not sure if there's anything else to add.
No, I think that's exactly right, Michal. In addition to the subscriber-specific samples, we also conduct a national sample, which is a cross-section of businesses throughout all jurisdictions in Canada.
Okay, thank you. And the next one is curious about how businesses are recruited and what the response rates were.
The response rates are really quite good for this study. I don't want to say a number, but because I haven't thought about that recently, but response rates are quite good. We identify the ICCS as a sponsor and really encourage people to participate based on the importance of providing input to governments, and we find that really is motivating for a lot of both business people and also for consumers when we're doing the citizens first work. A lot of people would really like their governments to know that, hey, you're doing a great job. And there's a lot of people who really want their governments to know that, hey, I'm not too happy. So I think the topic is compelling, and I also think that the sponsorship of the ICCS gives us a great deal of credibility, and so as a result, response rates are good. We also made exceptional efforts in some of the regions where we found that the number of available businesses to be interviewed were smaller than we expected, where we really amped up our efforts in terms of number of calls made, referral telephone numbers, secondary research to find alternate numbers for the businesses that had been selected, and so forth. But across the board, for all of the samples, we call up to 5 times, we utilize appointments, we utilize referrals. If the person that we ask to speak to the general manager, and if that person hasn't used government services, then we take the time to find the person who does and to make repeat calls to that person in an effort to complete the interview.
Thank you. So the next question is, does the national report indicate which type of government department services, for instance, at the federal level, CRA, ESDC, etc., were included? And I think we've kind of answered it already. I'm not sure. So the answer is basically no, we don't provide that type of specific information. But again, I'm not sure, Marina, if there's anything to add.
No, that is absolutely true. We don't go down to the government level. The sample size really just would not permit it when we're looking at a recent service transaction. I will say, though, it's interesting, CRA was one on the list. If you go through the verbatim responses when people are telling us what they would like to see improved with government service provision, CRA's name comes up. So there's certainly a wealth of information in the verbatim comments, but in terms of the statistical side, no, we don't look at it on an individual departmental level.
Okay, excellent. So the next question is interesting and very timely. Would you have any insights to share about the business preference for more digital services in light of the recent telecom outage?
That's super interesting and not something we can answer, obviously, as the research period had come and gone before then. I'd love to get out there and do some research on how businesses are feeling about that outage, and certainly we've all I think heard quite a few comments from consumers about how they felt about it and how critical it was. I saw a news article online yesterday saying that somebody couldn't call 911 and as a result a family member died. I'm just like, oh my gosh, I hadn't even, considered that. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the fallout from all of that will be, and of course the government plays a role there too in terms of regulation and so on. So yes, absolutely fascinating, but not something we can address given that our research period was early spring.
Okay, thank you, Marina. The next question is, it looks like businesses really avoid the use of the in-person channel, but when they actually use that channel, they love it. Do we know what it is we're doing in person that we could focus on adopting in other channels?
That's a really good question and a super interesting one, and not one that's really easy to answer. It's true, in-person channels get higher ratings than non-in-person channels, and we can certainly see a wealth of areas where the digital channels can be improved. There's some things in a human interaction that are as simple as a smile, that are as simple as, oh, I hear you. Oh, that isn't something I deal with, but let's see what we can do. And it's that, going the extra mile and showing caring and concern about people. Now, that's hard to translate into a digital environment, but I think that we need to be thinking along those lines. How can we make our digital face friendlier? How can we make it easy for people to feel like, oh, somebody's going to help me, somebody cares about me?
Okay, thank you, Marina. So we only have a couple of minutes left, so maybe you have time for one or two additional questions. And one of them is wondering how closely business satisfaction tracks citizen satisfaction with government services.
Well, certainly, we looked at a number of measures in terms of the Ipsos disruption barometer, which is not part of this particular study. And what we've seen is that businesses in Canada are more positive in general than the general population. And maybe, if you're going to start a small business, and in that case, it was small businesses that we're looking at, maybe you have to be a bit more of an optimist. I don't know. But at the same time, I would expect that if were we to do a Citizens First survey during that same period of time, I think we would see very similar patterns, if not absolute numbers, but very similar patterns in terms of the client satisfaction index being down slightly, but not hugely. Same thing, there would probably be a slight decline in consumer satisfaction with government services as well. That would be my expectation, but we didn't conduct that research, so I can't be sure.
Okay, thank you, Marina. And I think this is unfortunately all the time that we had for the questions. So if we didn't get to your question, I do apologize. Please feel free to contact us separately and we would be happy to respond to that. Before we wrap things up, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining this webinar, and thank you, Marina, obviously, for a great presentation. I would like to encourage everyone to go to our website, citizenfirst.ca, to get a copy of the full report. And I know one of the questions that we didn't get to was about whether or not the slide deck would be available. We will be making available a recording of this session, and that should be available very soon. So please be on the lookout for that. Again, you can contact us directly, but we will also be posting it on our on various channels. So again, I encourage you to visit our website and to contact us directly. Contact the ICCS directly with any questions or comments about the study. And that's it. That's it on this end. Thank you so much for joining us, and I wish you all a great day. Thank you so much.